Tonight, the Chancellor says she's determined to live within our means, as she's warned her plans could be ruined by world events. I'll speak to the Treasury as Rachel Reeves unveils deeper cuts to benefits, and the UK's growth forecast for 2025 is halved. Plus, I'll be joined live by the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, who says the Chancellor is the architect of her own misfortune. As we hear, more than 3 million UK households will lose out from benefit cuts. How's that news gone down in the Chancellor's own constituency in Leeds? Plus, as Reeves has warned that global factors could knock her off course, Donald Trump is due to announce new car industry tariffs in the next hour. And just how happy are Labour backbenchers about the Chancellor's statement, with some more shy than others? We've been trying to find out. All that and more with Tim Montgomerie and John McDonnell, who've been giving clear instructions. If anyone asks, they are always happy to be here with us. It's Wednesday. I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Now, there is a lot to discuss today. Changes to welfare, defence spending, spending cuts that will come in the years ahead. But I just want to talk about something else, because it seems to me that all of the policy announced today all seems to stem from this one thing. At the budget, Rachel Reeves left herself £9.93 billion of headroom, the leeway, if you like, in case the economic picture changes. And a lot has changed since the budget last October. That headroom was wiped out and more. But after today's changes, the headroom is exactly the same. Not roughly the same, exactly the same. It is still £9.93 billion, which feels slightly odd. It feels a bit like the starting point wasn't the policy. The starting point was the aim to make sure the headroom was exactly the same. And look, it's been painful getting to this point. There's a lot of anxiety around the welfare changes in particular, and that's before we start talking about the impact of those future spending cuts. But if you want proof that this is a government that is determined to stick to its fiscal rules above all else, well, the fact the headroom is exactly the same is pretty good proof to me. One last thought. We've seen how quickly that headroom was wiped out in the last 5 months, and we should brace ourselves that this could happen again. And if this is a Chancellor who remains this determined to stick to those self-imposed rules, well, there could be some more painful decisions to come. First, let's look back at the main story of the day. Here's our political editor, Beth Rigby.
If she's feeling the pressure, it doesn't show. A Chancellor in a very tight spot, but smiling still as she faces up to a government with less money and hard choices to make. This wasn't a budget, but it felt like it.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Red pen all over her economic plans.
Now our task is to secure Britain's future in a world that is changing before our eyes.
More money then for defence, and no stepping back from her rule to fund day-to-day government spending from tax receipts, not borrowing, by the end of the decade.
I said that our fiscal rules were non-negotiable, and I meant it. I said it at the election, I said it at the budget, and I say it again today.
But since the election and budget, the economy's taken a turn for the worse. This, the hard truth.
The OBR have today revised down our growth forecast for 2025, from 2% in the autumn to 1% today. I am not satisfied with these numbers, and that is why we, on this side of the House, are serious about taking the action needed to grow our economy.
Growth down, debt repayment costs up, the Chancellor filling the black hole in her fiscal plans with a £14 billion repair job, including £4.8 billion of welfare cuts.
If we do nothing, we are writing off an entire generation. That cannot be right, and we will not stand for it. It is a waste of their potential, and it is a waste of their futures, and we will change it.
The harsh reality, 3.2 million families hit financially, losing on average around £1,700 a year.
These plans mean that welfare spending as a share of GDP will fall between 2026 and the end of the forecast period.
But the Chancellor at pains to prove her plan is working, and this rabbit of sorts had her beaming. The government's controversial planning reforms forecast to add nearly £7 billion to the economy.
The OBR have today concluded that these reforms will permanently increase the level of real GDP. That is the biggest positive growth impact that the OBR have ever reflected in their forecast.
This a Chancellor grasping at any good news.
Delivering security for our country and security for working people. And I commend this statement to the House.
A proud and pleased-looking Prime Minister, but the Tories pinning economic failure firmly on her.
This Chancellor constantly trying to blame forces beyond her control. The right response is not to duck responsibility, but to build a resilient economy. And now we are all paying the price of her broken promises. Today's numbers confirm it. We are poorer and we are weaker.
A Chancellor who raised 40 billion in taxes but 5 months ago at the budget, now coming back for more, this time in spending cuts. Is it time for you to level with people and admit that your plan hasn't protected them? And the truth is that you are going to have to come back for more tax rises or spending cuts in the budget in October.
We did have to make a number of difficult decisions on tax and welfare and on spending in the budget last year, but we have now wiped the slate clean. There's lots of speculation that I was going to change taxes today. The Tories were desperate to call this an emergency budget. It was far from it. We have found efficiencies in public spending.
So you're not coming back for more?
Well, I'm not going to write 4 years' worth of budgets. I've just delivered a spring statement today, but I think you can see through this spring statement how determined I am, how determined this government is to live within the means that we set ourselves.
But back in the House of Commons, the welfare cuts dividing the Chancellor's own benches.
Making cuts instead of taxing wealth is a political choice, and taking away the personal independence payments from so many disabled people is an especially cruel choice.
It is not right that disabled people and the most vulnerable in our society should pay for that.
This perhaps a sign of things to come as the Chancellor faces into the clamour of welfare cuts at home and a global economy packed with risk. Many noises off, and so much that could still knock her off course. Beth, Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, our economics and data editor Ed Conway has been taking a deeper dive into the numbers. Let's take a look.
Right, let's start with the big figure, GDP, growth, economic growth, and just how well the economy is doing. This is how fast the economy looked like it was growing last time around. 2% growth this year, 1.8, 1.5 in the coming years. Here is how it has changed. So a big downgrade this year, down from 2% to 1%. That has consequences, but this is the thing the Chancellor's been focusing on, upgrades in the future years. And in part, that's because the Office of Budget Responsibility, which comes up with these figures, thinks that some of her growth-related reforms are actually going to bear fruit. So that's the good news. But the bad news is there's potentially more borrowing to come. And this is where it really matters. She has a couple of these fiscal rules, and the most important of them is that she needs to get the current budget, which is basically day-to-day spending, down away from its deficit that it has at the moment towards a surplus by the end of this 5-year forecast. Last time, she was heading for a £9.9 billion surplus, so that was the headroom people talk about. This time, look at the updated figures. Lo and behold, it's still £9.9 billion. In fact, it's not just £9.9 billion, it's £9.93 billion, which is exactly the same it was to 2 decimal places as it was last time around, which might lead you to think nothing has changed. But beneath the surface, an awful lot has changed, OK? Let's have a look at what has been going on. That's the £9.9 billion. That's the headroom she had against her fiscal rule. It was actually wiped out. You wouldn't have guessed this, but it's wiped out by the fact that you've got higher debt interest costs and that weaker growth we were talking about a second ago. So she's had to do some stuff. She's had to include some extra efficiency, tax efficiency, anti-evasion models, which bring it up a few £1 billion. She's switched some spending from aid to defence. That also benefits this because it's current spending, which is most prevalent when it comes to aid. So you've got less of that. She's done some spending cuts, big spending cuts. You'll see that in a second. And also those welfare cuts. Now, last time when the government talked about those welfare cuts, they said it was going to bring in about £5 billion or save about £5 billion. But actually, no. The OBR's come along and said, no, it's going to be less than that. Even so, lo and behold, they get to that magic £9.9 billion figure. But what along the way are the consequences? Think about what's going on with those welfare changes. Getting rid of the personal independence payment, or rather changing the eligibility for the personal independence payment, that means 50,000 children, 250,000 adults potentially go into poverty. So you're raising poverty, pushing children into poverty, not to mention adults as well. Those universal credit changes, another 50,000 adults into poverty. Tot it all up. And it's at least 350,000 extra people in poverty that weren't potentially going there before. So there are consequences in getting to that £9.9 billion. Spending too. This is what Jeremy Hunt was planning to spend in the coming years, about 1% increases in current spending. This is what Rachel Reeves was planning last time around. Look critically here. She didn't want to have as low spending totals as Jeremy Hunt. But now, the latest figures suggest she will be spending about the same as Jeremy Hunt was in terms of the annual increase by the end of this forecast horizon. So that's significant as well, and all to try to get to that £9.9 billion. She has got there. This is the headroom. If you look at the latest figure there, she's managed to avoid breaking her fiscal rule. But now take a step back and you'll note that given that this is way less headroom than most chancellors have had in the past, we may, who knows, in a few months' time, being having quite the same conversation about headroom all over again.
Ed Conway there. Well, we can speak now to Beth Rigby, our political editor. Well, we've just been looking at the kind of headline figures. Ed's been looking at the numbers. What mood are you picking up from Labour MPs about what was announced today?
Well, it's obvious to say, first off, this is really uncomfortable. 3.2 million people, on average £1,700 worse off from welfare cuts. And as Ed was saying, 300,000 people or more pushed into relative poverty. So, first off, this is uncomfortable for any Labour MP, and many of them are wondering how they go and discuss this on the doorstep. It's uncomfortable. But the other thing I would say about it is that there isn't a full-blown rebellion emerging. There have been voices in the Commons, and John is here, and I'm sure he will add to it, that have been vocal about these are the wrong decisions, these are the wrong choices the Chancellor is making. There will be an argument, I think, building from MPs that maybe she should look again actually at raising revenue, i.e. taxes, rather than cuts to the most vulnerable in society. But I think she has bought herself a bit of time in that she has laid out her argument. She has told a story about the plan is working into the longer term as she's grasping at any good news she could get her hands on, which was, upgrades in growth forecast to the back end of the Parliament. And also, she clung on to that news about some of the growth policies that they're putting in, such as housing, actually adding to GDP. And one MP said to me that these are tough circumstances and people do understand that she's serious about turning around the public finances. And you only have to look at how the Prime Minister reacted to her to see that this is still a front bench behind her, even if in private, a little bit of unhappiness from some, and she is sticking to the course. But Sophie, I think there's a bigger question in all of this that Ed and I alluded to in our reports, which is the headroom is still tiny. There are potential trade wars about to happen. There is global uncertainty and volatility. And it is quite probable that in the autumn she has to come back for more. And what does that look like? Is that further tax rises? Is it further spending cuts? Or does she break her fiscal rules? Now, on the latter, she is immovable at the moment, but all of them are hard choices for the Chancellor. So I would say today, she's tried to make the best out of a bad set of circumstances she's got. John will say, well, they're the choices she's made. And she's kicked the can down the road here, and there could be very difficult choices for her further down the line. So I think she'll be relieved to have got through the day and she'll be relieved that there isn't a massive clamour of opposition towards her, but the pressure is not going anywhere, and in fact it could build. So I think she's in a difficult spot.
Yeah, it's the question that you asked her when you got the chance at that news conference as well. Beth Rigby, thank you very much indeed. Beth Rigby there, our political editor. Well, of course, there'll be lots and lots of reaction to the spring statement in tomorrow's newspapers as well. We'll have our extended press preview from 10:30 this evening with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Joining us for that will be the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and the Telegraph's comment editor Annabelle Denham. Right, let's bring in our duo for the evening, shall we? The former Shadow Chancellor, currently sitting officially as an independent MP after he was suspended from the Labour Party, Parliamentary Labour Party, I should say, John McDonnell, and the founder of Conservative Home, now member of Reform UK, that's Tim Montgomerie. Great to have you both with us today. John, what's your reaction to today?
Just to say, I'm not an independent MP, I'm a suspended Labour MP. Just get that out of the way, sorry.
No, absolutely, very fair.
I don't mean to be pedantic, but that's the reality.
What's your reaction
What's
to
the reaction? OK, I think Beth's got it right. There's on the overall approach, we all sign up to growth, well, most chancellors do anyway, don't they? We all sign up to growth. We all want to see investment, particularly in housing, so everyone welcomes that. We all understand the situation has changed since the budget because of the world affairs and particularly the arrival of Trump. So therefore, it is about choices. And there isn't a huge upfront revolt at the moment within the, but there's an awful lot of depression and resentment. And there has been one of the meetings, from what I hear, of the Parliamentary Labour Party briefing session, there were a lot of angry MPs. And people are saying, well, why do you ruin an economic strategy by bringing forward cuts like this? The figures are getting worse. Joseph Rowntree Trust put their figure out, 400,000 people being pushed into poverty. I was looking at some of the detail of this. I chair a carers group, an unpaid care group. There's 150,000 people who lose carers allowance. These are people who care for relatives usually. This is horrendous, and it's not. I think what Labour MPs are saying, this isn't what Labour does in government. This isn't us. This isn't us. And why can't we just look at, it's not about breaking the fiscal rule, it's looking at that issue around taxation. And if you're trying to save anything between 5 and 10 billion, we spend 1.2 trillion. This is, I know it sounds a lot of money, 5 to 10 billion, but actually in the overall budget of a government, it actually is almost like the money down the sofa. You could have a range of sort of marginal changes on taxation, focused on those who can bear it the most, according to Keir Starmer's principles, the biggest burden should fall on the heaviest shoulders. You could have a range of minor, marginal changes, and you'd be able to cover the cost of this. And people can't understand why that isn't occurring. In the longer term, in terms of the fiscal rule, well, to be frank, the world has changed, so you have to adapt to the world changing. So there can be interpretation of the fiscal rule by the time we get to the budget that overcomes some of these problems. And that's what's happening across Europe. Look at Germany. They're changing their constitution to enable them to borrow more money. So I just think a lot of Labour MPs will think, why are we in this situation? Because when you go back to your constituencies, I'm in my email box at the moment, you could read some of the emails from my constituents and you would weep. You would weep. They feel fearful about loss of benefit. They're already struggling, and some of them aren't going to cope. So I'm hoping, Beth's right, we've got a bit of a breathing space now between now and the expenditure review published in June, then the budget in the autumn. I think there'll be a lot of work going on by Labour MPs saying to the Chancellor, we've got to get out of this mess. And there are routes out that do not contradict the overall economic strategy.
Tim.
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with John on the welfare reforms. John won't have supported them, but when I worked for Ian Duncan Smith, when we least made our welfare reforms, there was a vision of something different. Universal credit was put into place to incentivise work. A lot of the trouble with this sort of changes is it's like cheese paring. Cuts are being made without a vision being put in.
Because I supported universal credit as a concept bringing together. Ian Duncan Smith was rolling it out, and then the Treasury big boots came in.
It was George Osborne's cuts that
cut it, and then Ian resigned.
Yeah, exactly.
And that you feel there's almost repeating history.
We're on the same page, which is not a good look, but for either of us probably.
But it's almost like a repeat of history. The big boots of the Treasury.
It's the Treasury.
Orthodox policy being implemented. I think Rachel needs to look again at the advice she's getting, because when you come in and you're looking for a longer-term strategy, you want reform, the last thing you want to do at the early stages is be branded as hitting the portion.
Well, I think where we're probably agreed is the power of the Treasury in Whitehall is something that needs to be addressed long-term. But the bigger picture, I think, is this government's fundamental mission was to grow the economy, and it was a good mission and it's an essential mission. But look at the numbers that Ed Conway was sharing with us a little while ago. Growth is actually really very flat for the whole of this parliament, not getting any higher than, I think, 1.8, 1.9%. You know, in terms of its own rhetoric, in terms of its own objectives, this is a disappointing performance. And when you look at things that they are doing, which I welcome, that the Conservative government didn't do, like build houses, look at the small print, and actually the number of extra houses that are coming in, 1.5 million, if they are delivered over the course of this parliament. Look at the amount of extra immigration into the country, which the OBR based its statistics on, 1.5 million households. So all the extra house building that the government is promising to deliver and hasn't yet delivered is going to be taken up by the failure of this government to control immigration. And I think that's what sort of frustrates people, is the lack of joined-up thinking between what the government's rhetoric is and what the performance indicators say is going to happen.
I mean, I think it's fair to put some of the government's points here, which is, you know, that growth, yes, has been cut in the short term, but it is ticking up in the longer term, partly because some of the measures that they put in, and also that they are under pressure because of the cost of servicing their debt. You know, we spend more on debt than we do on education, right? Yeah. It's not an easy corner to come out of.
That's why you do need to balance the books. I did advise from the very beginning, if you remember, we've discussed this before, when you invest to get growth, it takes time. And in the meantime, you will need to look at how you actually balance the books. And the way you balance the books is you have a fair taxation system. I think this thing about immigration is balderdash, because actually we've got an growing older population, and actually immigration is stimulating our economy. It provides us with growth. However,
some immigration does, not all immigration. It depends what kind of immigration.
If you look at the history of it, largely. But on the whole issue about how do you balance the books, you take political decisions on that, and that means making sure that you've had a taxation system which is fair, and therefore is the wealthiest paying more.
Can I ask, because you obviously served in the shadow cabinet with Keir Starmer, so you worked with him.
Yeah.
What do you think his political philosophy is?
I can't tell. I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but I cannot tell. When he was in the shadow cabinet with me, he supported every manifesto we put up in 2017 and 19. He supported every budget I put up and campaigned for them. Now, the policies he's pursuing, again, on issues like this, I just can't tell what the derivation of it is.
Some would say on benefits, because I know that you are both really on the sort of similar page on benefits, but some would say on benefits that the reason that they're looking at benefits is because we are an outlier and because there is a benefits bill that they would say is unsustainable. Yeah. What would you say to that?
Well, look, I think we are on an outlier in Europe for the amount of people dependent upon benefits, particularly after lockdown. But I can think of my own journey. I had serious anxiety issues that grew up during lockdown, and I was helped quite expensively by my employer and by family and friends to get to the place that I'm in now. It was not a money-saving exercise for the state. Actually, to get someone... I wasn't perfectly dependent on benefits, but if I was in a similar position as people on benefits, it would not be a linear process. And so if you want to get the number of people that are dependent on the state at the moment to where you want them to be as full citizens, you know, fulfilling their potential, you have to support them. Universal support was as important as universal credit when Ian Duncan Smith had his vision of universal credit. It's not cheap in the long run, in the short run. You save money and you develop people in the long run. But I think the government are mixing up two objectives at the moment. One is welfare reform, which is a very honourable thing, and the other is to keep the budget under control, which is also honourable, but balancing that budget on the backs of the poor and I say this is a reform, an ex-Tory, I am very surprised that there isn't more rebellion inside the Labour ranks at how Labour are trying to balance the books.
We'll have more on that later. Thanks both very much for your analysis today. You're watching the Politics Hub. Coming up, Rachel Reeves claws back her headroom and reiterates that her fiscal rules are non-negotiable. We'll have more on that coming up next.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent.
You are not getting in this elevator, okay?
The judge made it very clear that she could see no justifiable reason why Sakulas wasn't here facing British justice.
I promised I would get him justice.
Free, wherever you get your news. This is what they're up against, that the wind is the really big problem. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? This is the exact spot in Nottingham where their 19-year-old son, Barnaby Webber, lost his life.
I just think it's so cruel and so harsh.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
Sky News gets the full story first. Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. It's legal to let go. Set the speed and take the hands off. It's almost driverless, but not quite. Hans is a highly trained police dog. The force is incredible. It's really frightening, actually. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story. I'm ready. Are you? Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Hey, welcome back. Well, Rachel Reeves today referred to global uncertainty as a driver for her welfare changes, and overshadowing all the decisions she makes on the economy is the rather unpredictable man in the White House. Well, Donald Trump is due to speak shortly, which will bring you to that live. In the meantime, though, we can speak to Sky's correspondent, David Blevins. Thank you very much for being with us. David, how much of an impact is the US having here in the UK?
Sophie, I think it would be impossible to exaggerate the impact that it's having because of Donald Trump's policy on tariffs. He's going to say more about that, we understand, this afternoon. He has for quite some time talked about April the 2nd as Liberation Day for the United States, when he intends to impose what he calls reciprocal tariffs on countries where they impose tariffs on US products coming in. That caused the markets to drop to a session low yesterday. News of the fact that he is going ahead with that. And in fact, today we think he's going to talk about more tariffs on the auto trade. And the reason there's so much volatility in the market here is because Donald Trump goes from imposing tariffs one day on places like Canada and Mexico and China and lifting them the next day. So businesses actually don't really know how to prepare. And there's also a real concern beyond businesses among American consumers that it is they who are ultimately going to pay the price, a higher price on products that are brought in from other countries, because distributors are going to have to, distribute those costs somewhere. But there's another reason why Donald Trump may want to talk about auto tariffs today. And of course, that's because he's basically saying, look over here, don't look over there, because his administration right now is engulfed in the the first proper scandal of his presidency over the fact that his officials were discussing something as sensitive as a US airstrike on Houthi rebels in Yemen in that Signal messaging group. It's the one thing that is dominating the news in the United States, and you can understand, therefore, why Donald Trump would want to focus on something else right now.
Thank you very much indeed, David Blevins, there in Washington. Well, we can return to the UK and that spring statement because we're joined now by the Treasury Minister, James Murray.
Good evening.
It's great to have you here. A lot of MPs will be wrestling with their consciences today. The impact assessment published by the government says the changes to welfare could push 250,000 people into poverty, including 50,000 children. Are you personally comfortable with that?
I'm very comfortable with the fact that we are a government who is going to address some of the problems with the welfare system that we know are present. We know that the welfare system is broken. We knew that when we were elected. I think everyone across the political spectrum will agree that we can't carry on and just leave the welfare system as it is, and so we need to reform it. And
are you comfortable with pushing children into poverty?
Well, let me be clear about those figures that you mentioned, because they are essentially one side of the story. So that's the direct...
Why did you publish them in that case?
Because the positive impacts of our reforms in terms of getting people into work are ones that the OBR is going to score, and they said they will do that later in the year at the autumn budget and so on, because they have to get the right evidence to show what the impact will be in terms of getting people into work. But we know that getting people into work is the best route out of poverty, and that's why one of the key principles of the reforms that we're making to welfare is about getting people into work. It's about making sure there isn't an incentive to stay out of work, and where people can work and need support to get into work, that support is available.
I mean, I remember a time when the Labour Party was talking about eradicating child poverty. I remember in your manifesto when you said too many children's life chances are being scarred by rising poverty. I mean, what happened to that Labour Party?
Yeah, and no one can doubt the commitment of the Labour Party to tackling child poverty.
But you can doubt the commitment when you're reading your own impact assessment that says 50,000 children could be pushed into poverty by the changes you're bringing in.
Well, as I'm sure you know, there's a child poverty task force which the government has set up and is doing its work at the moment, and that's to focus on all of the different levers that we have to tackle child poverty. But as I said, in relation to those specific numbers, that shows one half of the story about the direct impact of some of the changes which are being made. But the other side, which the OBR will evaluate in due course, is about helping people into work. And that is the best route to get people out of poverty. And that's why these reforms that we're setting out are so important, about making sure that we don't write people off and say to people, you know, it's OK just not to work and be economically active for years, even when you can work and with the right support, you know, very much would work. And that's why we need to change the system.
The thing that I've been really focusing on today is the headroom, because the headroom at the budget was 9.93 billion, and after everything that's happened in the last 5 months, a lot, the headroom is exactly the same. So it feels a bit of a, well, not a coincidence. It feels almost as if that was the thing that you started with, trying to make sure the headroom matched up and the policy came after. I mean, who's setting policy here? Is it the Treasury or the OBR?
Well, what we started with was the Chancellor's fiscal rules, and as she made really clear when she set them out in the budget in October last year, those fiscal rules are non-negotiable. And the conclusion that everyone can take very clearly from what she set out today is that she really meant it, because we're going to stick to those fiscal rules to make sure that we provide that fiscal responsibility, that economic stability, because it's on the basis of that stability that we can increase investment, increase growth and make people better off, because that's the driving mission for us as a government.
Some people are questioning whether that focus on the fiscal rules, as you said, that it feels like that is the priority. It is right. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation, for example, said today, with living standards for the poorest under continuing assault, the government needs to protect people from harm with the same zeal as it attempts to build its reputation for fiscal competence. What would you say to that?
Well, I think I would be clear that, you know, fiscal responsibility has a cost. It means taking difficult decisions, but fiscal irresponsibility comes with a far greater cost. You know, we saw that a few years ago with Liz Truss. You know, we know that when you're fiscally irresponsible, when you lose control of the public finances, it is working people, it is people with the fewest resources, people with the least wealth, the least income, they are the ones who get hit hardest when the government loses control of the public finances. And that's why, for us, fiscal responsibility is so central to what we're doing as a government.
I mean, can we take from that that will continue throughout this government? Because I guess the reason I'm asking is we saw how quickly the headroom was wiped out, and there will be an argument about whether that was the government's fault or whether that is global factors over which you have no control at all.
Or the
right?
OBR has pointed to wider factors.
Yeah, exactly. So those wider factors could easily happen again this year. So can you rule out tax rises in the next budget?
Well, look, I would never presume to write 4 budgets ahead of the rest of this Parliament's worth of budgets.
You said that you'll stick to the fiscal rules, so we can take that as a given, right?
What I can tell you, absolutely, the Chancellor will stick to the fiscal rules. They are non-negotiable. They were when they were introduced. They are today. They will remain non-negotiable because they're the bedrock of the fiscal responsibility that underpins how we operate as a government.
I spoke to Mervyn King, the former governor at the Bank of England, a few weeks ago, and he was pretty clear. He said, I think we will have to raise the basic rate of income tax. He said that there's no harm in doing that, provided it's been used to finance what he described as a well-thought-through programme of spending reform. I mean, is this the situation that we are in now, that, tax rises are going to be the reality?
Well, no, the reality is that we want to grow the economy because we know that's the way to get into a better position.
Well, it's been halved. It's been halved this year.
Well, the figure in 2025 has been downgraded.
Oh, yeah, we really trust the ones that have...
But look at 2026 and every subsequent year in what the OBR
You'll
published today.
forgive me that I'm sceptical about future growth forecasts, right? We've seen the history on them.
Well,
They're continually being downgraded.
So the OBR usually takes some effort to show a positive impact of reforms, of changes to things like planning policy. What the OBR have recognised today is that the planning changes we're making are so profound, are of such a big scale, that they are saying, yes, actually, we accept that these changes you're making to the planning system, they're the real deal. Like, they really will increase the number of homes by 170,000. They will get up 1.3 million homes over the 5-year period, and they will increase GDP, increase the money which is coming into the public finances by over £3 billion. So the OBR, independent forecaster, who doesn't accept these things lightly, has said these planning reforms you're making are the real deal and they will boost economic growth. And that's what we need to do even more of as a government. So look at the money that we're putting into defence as well. That's obviously crucial for our national security, but it also helps with economic growth as well, because we can invest in British businesses and create more jobs here in the UK. So all of what we're pushing towards is making sure that people are better off, and that's on the back of economic growth.
OK, thank you very much indeed. Great to have you on the programme today. Well, we have been, of course, talking an awful lot about how global factors could affect Rachel Reeves's plans. We are due an announcement on auto tariffs by President Trump. He'll be speaking from Washington, and that is due to happen after 8 p.m. It's during the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee. A little taste of what that could be. We will bring it to you as soon as we get a bit more details from this. The pictures now from Washington are of a Women's History Month event in the White House East Room, where he's currently speaking. And then, of course, that announcement on the motor industry tariffs will happen afterwards. We'll keep across it. If he says anything newsworthy, we'll bring that to you now. Well, the Shadow Chancellor, Mel Stride, is here with us now. Thank you very much for being
Pleasure.
with us.
Good to see you.
Fresh from your appearance in the House of Commons. What's your reaction to what we saw today?
I think it was a moment of reckoning. I think this was a moment when we saw that the Chancellor had lost control of the public finances, and I think that will have, and is having, deep impacts on real people up and down the country. We're seeing higher inflation, higher prices, interest rates higher for longer, more on people's mortgages. And we're seeing growth, of course, that was halved this year. We're seeing inflation that is double, actually over double what it was at the time when we were in government, the forecast then. We're seeing unemployment now forecast to be increasing in each of this year, next year, the year after, and flat thereafter. And we saw that fiscal headroom completely disappear and go underwater to the tune of over £4 billion. Now, the Chancellor has scrabbled around and saved some money and done some things on welfare in haste to try and make that up. But it doesn't give you much confidence as we go into the autumn and the next budget that she's not going to end up in a similar situation again. You
know, listening to your answer just there, high inflation, borrowing, poor growth, I mean, it could have been someone talking about you guys, couldn't it? An opposition Chancellor would say exactly the same thing about you when you were in government.
So I think let's take inflation. So inflation was high under the last government. It actually hit 11.1% in October 22. But that was for external reasons. That was the
but
war.
But
let me make this point.
Let me just come, because you can't...
Well, you've asked the question.
But I have to come back in, because you can't only take responsibility, only say that governments take responsibility for inflation when it's the other guys.
No, no. The point.
You can make the factor that actually, governments don't control inflation, but you were the one who brought it up then, saying it's, these guys' fault.
So what I was trying to do is to make a distinction between what happened under us, which was an external shock to the UK economy that was highly inflationary, and it was our job, working alongside the Bank of England, to bring that inflation figure down, which we did to 2%, to the target on the very day of the general election. What we've seen here with inflation increasing is a product of conscious decisions by this government, firstly to whack taxes, national insurance taxes on business, part of which gets passed on by way of higher prices, but equally to tax, borrow and spend in a way that Labour governments perhaps did back in the 1970s, which pushes up inflation as well.
So when inflation's high under the Conservatives, it's not your fault, but when it's high under Labour, it is their fault.
No, the point that I'm making is that government's interaction with inflation, under us it was to take the necessary steps to bring it down. What this government has actually done was inherited inflation at 2%. It's likely to peak, most forecasts are saying, at almost double that figure this year. So they have been inflationary. Now, that has real impacts on people up and down the country, because it means interest rates are higher for longer. That's a monetary policy response. So that means more expensive mortgages for people. It means businesses having to pay more on their borrowing costs. And it also means, given we've got a very large national debt, that the amount that we have to pay to service that debt, which is the main reason why her headroom disappeared almost entirely, goes up. So we are spending over £100 billion a year just on debt interest alone. And part of that is the inflation and interest rate response to government policy. Her choices.
A big part of what happened today was changes to welfare. And you, of course, used to be responsible for welfare when you were in government. You wanted to bring the benefits bill down. You said it was important to do that. So do you support the changes announced today?
So what I support is principled welfare reform. And what I mean by that is it has to be thoughtful, it has to be properly planned, and that's what we did when I was Secretary of State. We saved £5 billion across the forecast through making welfare reforms, 450,000 people, according to the OPR, not going onto those long-term sickness and disability benefits. But what you've seen with this government is not principled, careful, planned reform. They had no mention of PIP in their manifesto, for example. They came into office and pussyfooted around with welfare reform because it was deeply divisive within their own ranks. And then when Rachel Reeves suddenly discovered from the top of the sinking ship that they were running out of money, out went the call for the savings. It was rushed and it was botched and last minute. Now, that's not fair on millions of people, that many of whom are vulnerable and need to be supported, because you don't rush those decisions. And it's not fair on the taxpayer because they didn't save enough through the welfare changes that they're making.
You can argue about whether it was rushed, the motivation for doing it, the unhappiness in the Labour benches. But the principle of it, that we've got too many people claiming disability, particularly we've seen an increase with those with mental health concerns claiming benefit. You support that, don't you?
I support getting the welfare bill down, and I support making more progress than this government is making in doing that. But I would do it in that principled way that I've described. So if you take PIP...
What specifically
are
they
done
done
Let me give you
wrong?
an example. Yeah. So if you take PIP, OK, what they did was they just rushed in. They've changed the points that you have to get in order to qualify for PIP. So they slimmed down the gateway into that benefit. When I was Secretary of State, we actually consulted on a deep fundamental reform to PIP, which asked the basic question of whether that benefit and the way it operates is fit for purpose. And my view is that it isn't.
I'm genuinely just confused about what specifically you... Because you want to bring down the PIP.
With respect, I'm trying to explain. So what we need to do with PIP, for example, which is a big part of the changes that drive some of the savings that the government's bringing in, is not just snatch at the easy levers to save cost, but actually look at fundamental reform, which we in government had consulted on and looked at the way that that benefit actually works. And that's possibly a moment for another more detailed discussion. But there is a better and more targeted way of making sure that PIP, firstly, helps the people that need the help and supports them with additional costs of disability, but equally gets the bill down much more strongly than this government has achieved. So they've achieved the worst of all worlds, not enough savings, and actually it's going to be very tough on some people for whom a more thoughtful approach would be more appropriate.
OK, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Mel Stride there, the Shadow Chancellor. Coming up next on the Politics Hub. Today has been dominated by jargon and graphs, but talk of fiscal corsets and headroom all feels very far away from the real world. So how has the statement gone down with voters? We'll be heading to Rachel Reeves' constituency of Leeds West and Pudsey to find out. That's next. Welcome back. Now, we wanted to clarify something discussed on last night's programme. During an interview with Jeremy Corbyn, we talked about the Independence Alliance group of MPs, and I made a reference to one of its members, Mohammed Iqbal, as having been previously suspended by the Labour Party for allegedly making anti-Semitic comments in a meeting. We wish to make clear that Mohammed Iqbal is in fact a councillor. He's not an MP, not a member of this group. Rather, Iqbal Mohammed is a member of the Independence Alliance group of MPs and did not make such comments. We want to apologise for this error and any confusion that was caused. Now, cuts to benefits have helped to maintain the Chancellor's fiscal headroom, but will push 250,000 more people, including 50,000 children, into poverty over the next 5 years. She needs growth to square the circle. Sky's business and economics correspondent Paul Kelso has spent the day in Rachel Reeves' constituency of Leeds West and Pudsey to find out how the spring statement's gone down with voters and businesses.
Firstly, I want to talk about how it actually feels to be reliant on support from a government that
demonstrating in Leeds against welfare cuts being spelt out in Westminster. At their heart, changes to personal independence payments. Flick has been unable to find work for 4 years. She thinks she'll lose at least £100 a week.
I don't know how I will survive. I absolutely have no idea because I don't have any luxuries as it is. The whole point of personal independence payments is to fund the additional costs you have for being a disabled person. The government's got a funny idea about what incentivises people because, honestly, nobody was ever motivated to go to work or increase their productivity by being pushed into penury.
Welfare spending will take the single biggest cut to help make Rachel Reeves's numbers add up, and that will have real-world consequences. The government's own figures say 250,000 people will be pushed into relative poverty. Despite that, overall household income is forecast to grow, and that's not how it feels to people in the Chancellor's constituency. Pudsey is the place that centre to Parliament, with a 12,000 vote majority from a suburb where growth is not a given. At the Pudsey Community Project, demand is steadily rising, the cost of living squeezing even those with jobs.
It's one of the reasons why our pantry and our food bank and our children's clothing use scheme all are 6 days a week, including evening and weekend opening, because we know that a lot of the people we're supporting are in work either part-time or full-time. Some of them, just the cost of living are outstripping what their employment can give them to get by. Growth would fix a lot of the Chancellor's problems. For that, she needs businesses like this component engineers to thrive. But the tax rises coming next week make that hard work.
Considering we've had a pandemic, we've had Brexit, we've had global supply chain issues, the Suez Canal and a few wars just to throw in the mix, not to mention the political instability, we're doing okay. You know, we're holding our own with good, modest organic growth, and we're trying to stay positive. As we try and manage a business, if we're mitigating some of those increases in costs and some of the pressures around us, we're not focused on driving the business in really exciting, innovative ways.
In her constituency, never mind her party and Parliament, protests at the Chancellor's choices will continue. Paul Kelso, Sky News in Leeds West and Pudsey.
Well, some of Sky News' political team has been pretty much trapped in the studio for most of the day, not naming any names, poring over and analysing Rachel Reeves' statement. But, you know, the bosses do let us out occasionally. And our Deputy Political Editor, Sam Coates, was allowed to leave briefly and headed over the road to the corridors of power to find out how the statement had gone down with Labour MPs. Sam, what did you find?
There's a lot of nervousness. Look, you are not going to go into politics as a Labour MP in order to see benefit cuts of the sort that we're seeing today. You might understand the rationale and you might appreciate the spot that Rachel Reeves in, but you're not going to enjoy this moment, you're not going to like this moment at all. But I think there's something different today, Sophie. I'm really interested in what the panel make of this. I think today is a political moment because I'm talking to Labour MPs through the day from across the spectrum. And it's not that they just disagree with varying levels of vehemence about what Rachel Reeves has done. And it's not that some, like Clive Lewis, who we were talking to earlier, doesn't say that they're going to rebel. And there will be a rebellion on disability, but I'm not sure how big. I think the significance of today is whether you were worried about how it all came about, the way that Rachel Reeves sort of insists, Theresa May, like that nothing has changed, the fact that there was a mess up over the numbers with the OBR, the fact that you're having to make cuts all over the place. I just think maybe today was the day that some of the shine came off Rachel Reeves. Today was the day, I think a Rubicon was crossed for some MPs, some Labour MPs, where perhaps previously she was the chancellor, you know, she's got it, we leave it to her. Now there is a bit more of an open conversation that had been going on actually around the cabinet table. I think that's extended through bits of the parliamentary party. I think today was the day that she didn't look impregnable. You know, never meet your superheroes to, you know, close up. And I think today was the moment where people looked a little bit closer and were left wondering, has she really got it?
John, what was that?
I always follow the Tony Benn dictum. It's not personalities, it's policies, but it is accumulation of policies. On the two-child limit, all right, there was only a small number of us that rebelled, but it was in people's hearts. Why are they not lifting nearly 500,000 children out of poverty? Then winter fuel allowance came, and no one expected that. It just came out of the blue. There was an increase in tuition fees, and then overseas development aid cut by 50%. Now, for a lot of people out there, it doesn't really matter, but for Labour MPs, it does. It's part of their DNA. This isn't what you do. And then to come forward huge cuts, really, for disabled people. That really, it strikes at the heart of you being a Labour MP. So I think there is real concern now about the trajectory, and judgment is the issue as well. I'll just give you one example as well. When James was here, he's a good MP, he's a really hard worker in the Treasury team. And the argument, you know, you said to him, your own figures are saying 250,000 are going to be put into poverty. We know it's much more than that now. But then the argument is, well, a lot of those, they haven't taken into account that the numbers that will go into work. The OBR itself has said there'll be an increase in unemployment by 200,000. And I was checking the figures for underemployment. There's 4.7 million people underemployed looking for more work. There's 80,000 vacancies. Those sorts of things, that sounds like all stats, but they catch up on you. The narrative loses credibility. That's the problem. And that's what we're seeing today.
What is the narrative? I was talking to the family and friends and that, and asked them to describe what is happening. And you know what the person they most mentioned to me is George Osborne. They're seeing similarities between what Labour is doing now and what George Osborne was associated with. And it's almost like it's not the same scale of austerity that it was in George Osborne's time, but it's the similar rhetoric, similar cutbacks. And at least George Osborne, towards the end of his time, he had projects like the Northern Powerhouse, which he wasn't allowed to develop properly because he was ejected from office. But there was a vision there. And what I don't see from Rachel Reeves, and I think this is a real political problem for the government, is where are we at, and what's the vision? Where are we going with all of this?
I guess what they would say, right, is that, look, they have got these, you know, big projects that they're trying to do, that reform is coming, whether it's on GB Energy, whether it's on planning, and it's incorrect, they say, to say that it's austerity because there is more money going into things like the NHS, right? You know, it was a spending budget in...
The last budget, but the latest figures show that, you know, as we were just seeing on one of the graphs, the spending over the next few years is similar to Jeremy Hunt's. It was only that 1 year where spending really took off.
The big numbers are meaningless to people if you're a disabled person. You'll have your benefit cut. Or you're a carer, you're about to lose your carer's allowance. The big numbers are irrelevant. To you, it's austerity. And then this week, they come out with the potential of 50,000 job cuts in the civil service. Where did that come from? So there's announcement after announcement. That is surprising people. That's the problem.
It's been great to have you both on the panel tonight on a big day here in Westminster. Thank you very much, and thank you, Sam, as well, for your analysis throughout the day too. Big day here in Westminster, the spring statement, and of course we're really just kind of moving up to the statements to come as well. We're going to hear more from Donald Trump, the spectre really behind so many of the global changes we're seeing. So we will hear more from him on tariffs. I will see you tomorrow at 7 p.m. But up next, it is the UK Tonight with Sarah J. Mee. Donald Trump's been promising a special announcement on cars. I'm sure she'll be covering that. Stay with us.